Did Kash Patel just destroy his own career in exactly 38 seconds of absolute silence? Watch closely how Congressman Ted Lieu used a hidden audio recording to trap the FBI director under oath. There are certain moments when a congressional hearing completely stops operating like standard political oversight and begins functioning exactly like a criminal courtroom. This was undeniably one of those defining moments. What unfolded inside room 2141 of the Rayburn House Office Building at 11:22 a.m. was not a traditional line of questioning, nor was it predictable political theater. Instead, it was the clinical, controlled introduction of damning evidence against a witness who had absolutely no idea that this evidence even existed. Congressman Ted Lieu did not raise his voice to command the room. He did not interrupt the witness, and he strategically refused to chase Kash Patel through a convoluted maze of hypothetical scenarios, which is the typical tactic most politicians use when trying to score cheap points. He executed a maneuver that was far more dangerous. He waited patiently until Patel had already committed himself, firmly on the record and under oath, to a consistent pattern of denial that had successfully held up for 15 months. And then, without any grand announcement, Lieu fundamentally changed the rules of the room. This is precisely how seasoned prosecutors win the cases they have absolutely no right to lose, because the most devastating weapon in any interrogation is not the question itself. It is that split-second realization when the witness understands that the answer they just provided is about to catastrophically collapse. For nearly 2 hours that morning, Kash Patel looked exactly like a confident man who genuinely believed he would survive this hearing the exact same way he had survived every single one before it. He smoothly deflected pointed questions regarding the Epstein investigation. He successfully redirected timelines, and he leaned heavily on the familiar architecture of dense bureaucratic language that turns direct inquiries into an impenetrable procedural fog. Nothing in his physical posture suggested he felt at risk. Nothing in his vocal tone suggested any hesitation, and absolutely nothing in his rehearsed answers suggested that whatever was sitting on the desk in front of Ted Lieu could alter his fate. The meticulous setup for this exact moment had been building long before that morning arrived. It involved 7 rigorous weeks of preparation, enforced internal silence from Lieu's staff, and a small device that was brought into the chamber logged merely as a legislative research tool rather than what it truly was. No one on Patel's highly paid legal team bothered to ask about it, and no one on the opposing political side flagged it as a threat. That is the terrifying reality about audio evidence. If you do not know it is there, you simply cannot prepare a strategy to survive it. At exactly 11:19 a.m., when the committee chairman recognized Ted Lieu for his allotted 5 minutes, the entire room still assumed this exchange would follow the same tired script as every other oversight hearing. Lieu stood up without a massive stack of documents, without the heavy legal binders, and without any of the visual signals that usually warn a hostile witness that an attack is coming. He had just a single transcript page placed face down and a small, unassuming audio device positioned deliberately in front of him. When Lieu finally began speaking, his tone did not signal a heated confrontation, but rather a chilling precision. It was that quiet, clinical delivery of a man who does not need to try to dominate the room because he already knows he controls it. Director Patel. He began addressing him, not as a rival politician, but as a prosecutor, meticulously establishing an unassailable record. Lieu stated that he wanted to discuss a very specific conversation, emphasizing that it was not a theory, not a vague report, and not an unproven allegation. It was a conversation anchored to a precise date, a specific time, and a secure location that Patel clearly did not expect to matter the way it suddenly did. The date dropped was January 31st, 2025, at exactly 8:14 p.m. Located inside the J. Edgar Hoover building on the 7th floor, inside a secure room designated exclusively for sensitive director-level discussions. This is exactly where the atmospheric shift began, because Lieu was no longer asking Patel to explain or justify anything. He was forcing Patel into a corner where he had to either confirm or completely distance himself from a moment that had already been permanently locked, traced, and prepared as hard evidence. Patel's initial answer did what his answers had always reliably done. It actively avoided specificity, it quickly retreated into broad generalities, and it attempted to widen the conversational frame until the specific question itself lost its sharp edge. But something profound changed physically in Patel the exact moment that specific date landed in the room. There was a slight, almost imperceptible movement, a hand nervously adjusting against the wooden table. It was the kind of involuntary reaction that completely bypasses casual viewers, but stands out like a siren to anyone trained to observe human stress under controlled conditions. Lieu did not interrupt that revealing reaction, nor did he eagerly chase it down. He simply let it sit in the air, exactly the way a master prosecutor lets a silent jury notice what the arrogant witness does not even realize they have just revealed. And then Lieu aggressively narrowed the frame once again, methodically stripping away the rhetorical escape routes one by one until the question became entirely binary. Were you physically in that room on that specific night, yes or no? This is the exact juncture where most congressional hearings stall and fall apart. This is where clever witnesses negotiate, intentionally delay the clock, or entirely reframe the premise. But this trap was never designed to stall. It was designed to move relentlessly forward, regardless of whether Patel answered or refused to answer. The actual verbal answer was no longer the main point. The point was that the true answer had already been given, just not in that specific hearing room, not on that live microphone, and certainly not under conditions that Patel could manipulate. Once a prosecutor absolutely knows that a witness has permanently committed to a false version of events, the next logical step is not to argue with them about that version. The next step is to suddenly confront them with something so undeniable that it makes their lie impossible to maintain. At 11:22 a.m., Ted Lieu abruptly stopped asking questions altogether. He turned slightly, his hand calmly moving toward the small device that had been sitting in plain, unnoticed view the entire time, simply because it looked so ordinary. There was no dramatic Hollywood pause, no verbal warning, and no sudden escalation in his volume. He simply delivered a procedural statement for the official record, spoken with the exact same controlled cadence he had utilized from the very start. For the record, I am playing a 3-4-second audio recording obtained by my office, authenticated by 2 independent forensic analysts, Lieu stated. That sentence did not sound emotionally explosive. It sounded purely administrative, and that is exactly why the trap worked flawlessly. The legal objection from the defense came far too late to stop it. Patel's highly paid lead attorney was already frantically on his feet, loudly invoking the standard language of advanced disclosure, chain of custody, and procedural fairness. These are all the classic tools used to slow down something incredibly dangerous before it can fully enter the public record. But this was not a formal courtroom where evidence is quietly negotiated and suppressed before the jury is allowed to hear it. This was a live congressional hearing, and the committee chairman had already been provided with the rock-solid authentication beforehand. The final ruling came down quickly, cleanly, and with absolute finality. Objection noted, overruled, proceed. And just like that, the underlying rules of the universe shifted completely as Lieu pressed play. The audio that instantly filled that massive room did not crackle, it did not distort, and it did not carry any of the convenient acoustic imperfections that people instinctively look for when they desperately want to believe something is a fake. It was incredibly clean and intensely controlled, possessing the distinct acoustic signature you only get from a highly secured conference room specifically designed to contain classified conversations, not leak them. And then came the undeniable voice. It was Kash Patel's voice. It was not being interpreted, it was not being paraphrased, and it was not being dramatically described by someone else. It was his own voice, speaking 7 devastating words that did not require any further explanation or context to land with full, destructive weight in that room. Trump told me to bury it, all of it. Lieu did not let the tape run a single second longer than necessary. He stopped the recording exactly where the political and legal damage was entirely irreversible. But the silence that followed had infinite room to expand. And then there was absolutely nothing. 38 seconds of pure, unadulterated silence. There was no rapid follow-up question, no immediate aggressive challenge, and no attempt whatsoever to guide the room's reaction. It was just silence. But this was not the kind of awkward silence that stems from mass confusion. This was the heavy, suffocating kind of silence that comes from collective recognition. Every single person inside that chamber understood at the exact same moment what had just transpired, not because a pundit told them, but because they could vividly see it in the one place that matters most in a crisis like that. The witness, Kash Patel, did not react the way innocent people react when something entirely false is presented against them. There was no immediate, fiery denial, there was no instinctive physical rejection, and there was absolutely no visible attempt to reclaim control of the narrative. He completely froze. His hands remained perfectly flat on the wooden table, not gripping the edges, not pulling away, but just fixed rigidly in place, as if any sudden movement might somehow make the nightmare worse. His panicked eyes did not urgently search for his attorneys to save him. They did not look defiantly toward Ted Lieu, and they absolutely did not break toward the network cameras that were now broadcasting every microscopic fraction of his terrified expression. His breathing, which had become shallow and incredibly rapid, was the only visible physiological sign that his body had not shut down entirely. This specific detail is the part that most casual viewers entirely miss if they are not specifically trained to look for it. The complete absence of a reaction is not a sign of neutrality. It is hard, undeniable data. In stark interrogation rooms, in severe military proceedings, and in any high-stakes environment where spoken testimony carries severe legal consequences, the very first instinctive reaction to unexpected, damning evidence is almost always the most honest one. Long before the complex legal strategy engages, long before the defensive language is carefully filtered, and long before the witness mathematically calculates their risk, there is a brutal, unguarded moment where the human body responds much faster than the conscious mind can protect it. And for those agonizing 38 seconds, Kash Patel's frozen body told a spectacular story that his rehearsed words had not yet caught up to. Lieu methodically let every single ticking second of that silence accumulate and fill the room. He did not interrupt it, because any interruption would have mercifully relieved the crushing psychological pressure. Silence, when utilized correctly as a weapon, is never empty. It is pure, unbearable weight. By the time Lieu finally spoke again, the entire hearing was no longer about what could theoretically be proven in the future. It was entirely about what had already been witnessed by everyone. When Ted Lieu finally broke the silence, he did not raise his voice to artificially match the historic magnitude of the moment. Instead, he lowered it even further, flattening his tone into something far more dangerous than simple partisan outrage. Outrage can be easily dismissed by critics as mere politics, but absolute, chilling control cannot be dismissed. Director Patel, Lieu said, with every single word placed with surgical precision, I am going to ask you one question, not 5 questions, not a sequence, not an exchange. One question. He framed it in a way that made absolutely everything that followed legally irreversible. He coldly reminded the director that he was sitting under oath. He reminded him that every single syllable would enter the permanent congressional record. And then he executed the maneuver that experienced prosecutors use when they already hold all the cards. They remove every single escape hatch except the brutal truth. Is the voice on that recording your voice? There is zero linguistic ambiguity in that direct question. There is no convenient classification, shield to hide behind, no operational sensitivity to cite, and no executive privilege to broadly claim. You either legally recognize your own spoken voice, or you formally claim on the record that the recording is a malicious fabrication. Both distinct paths carry massive, life-altering consequences that absolutely cannot be walked back once spoken aloud. Patel opened his mouth, closed it silently, and in that fleeting fraction of a second, the energy in the room shifted once again. Hesitation in a critical moment like that is never neutral. It is frantic internal calculation. His lead attorney moved first, rising incredibly quickly and stepping aggressively into the silence before Patel could accidentally commit himself to a definitive position that might instantly collapse under its own legal weight. The lawyer desperately spouted language about necessary context, about the right to review the tape, and about appropriate settings. It was a barrage of procedural buffers explicitly designed to slow Lieu's momentum and regain some semblance of control. But Lieu completely refused to engage with the panicked speech. He did not stoop to argue the merits of the objection. He simply reduced the attorney to nothing. Counselor, Lieu said, turning his head just enough to acknowledge the annoying interruption without giving the man an ounce of actual authority. I asked your client whether that is his voice. Lieu then turned slowly back, locking the psychological frame exactly where it desperately needed to remain. Yes or no? This is precisely what flawless prosecutorial pressure looks like when it is executed cleanly. You do not needlessly overwhelm the hostile witness. You simply narrow their entire universe until there are only 2 doors left to open, and both of those doors lead somewhere the witness absolutely does not want to go. Because if Patel says yes, he instantly validates the secret recording, and with it, he validates the 7 damning words that have already detonated across that silent room. If he bravely says no, he is not just denying a passing statement. He is officially accusing 2 independent, highly credentialed forensic analysts of certifying a total falsehood submitted directly to the United States Congress. And if he chooses to say absolutely nothing, that deafening silence permanently becomes the definitive answer that will be endlessly replayed in every viral clip, printed in every newspaper headline, and dissected in every legal analysis for the next 72 hours. There is literally no safe option left on the table. So, Patel chose the only pathetic move that delays the ultimate consequence without actually eliminating it. I am not going to comment on the authenticity of a recording I have not had the opportunity to review with counsel, he carefully stated. His voice was noticeably lower now, entirely stripped of the arrogant, bouncing rhythm that had easily carried him through the first half of the morning. And that specific calculated answer did something incredibly critical. He did not outright deny the voice was his. He did not challenge the horrific content of the message. He did not even dare to suggest that the recording was a deepfake or a falsehood. He simply deferred. In ordinary, boring settings, deferral is viewed as neutral. But in a devastating moment exactly like this, deferral is an absolute confession of evidence. Lieu let that non-answer sit heavily in the air for 3 agonizing seconds. It was just long enough for the massive absence of a denial inside that answer to fully register with everyone watching. And then Lieu mercilessly introduced the next crushing layer. Evidence stacking is never just about landing one good blow. It is about systematically making any form of recovery impossible. He slowly picked up the single transcript page that had been lying face down the entire time and flipped it over. It was a certified transcript of those exact same 34 seconds, containing those exact same 7 words, fully authenticated by the exact same forensic analyst whose impeccable credentials were already formally on record with the committee. At the bottom of the page were the terrifying details that completely closed the loop: the exact timestamp, the exact date, and the specific room identifier. Conference Room 7C, inside the J. Edgar Hoover Building. It was the exact same room that Patel had just claimed he could neither confirm nor deny ever being inside of. Now, the glaring contradiction was no longer just a theoretical abstract concept. It was physical, printed, officially documented, and perfectly aligned with the damning audio that had already echoed through the chamber. And when Lieu spoke again, he was no longer politely asking for a clarification of events. He was coldly presenting an architectural structure of guilt that the witness simply could not dismantle. Director Patel, Lieu said, and now his tone shifted for one final, devastating time. It was not louder, and it was not sharper, but it was infinitely heavier, exactly like the final moments of a closing argument that has already been won, where the guilty verdict is simply waiting to be formally spoken into the permanent record. This precise recording has been formally submitted to the Department of Justice Inspector General, the FBI Office of Professional Responsibility, and the Senate Intelligence Committee as of this very morning. This was not phrased as a political threat or a future warning. It was a cold statement of fact that instantly relocated this crisis from a mere hearing room into 3 separate, highly powerful investigative tracks that were already aggressively in motion. And then Lieu did the one thing that defined the entire brutal exchange. He compressed all the noise and procedure down to the absolute core. 7 words, spoken slowly and clearly, played back into the tense air where no one in that room could ever pretend they did not hear them clearly. Trump told me to bury it. He let those words sit. Not for cheap drama, but for severe legal consequence. Because strategic repetition, while a witness is under oath, is not just for emphasis, It is for legal reinforcement. If those 7 words are indeed your words, spoken inside a secure FBI facility just 11 days into your tenure, Lieu continued, then every single statement you have ever made to this committee about agency independence, about making decisions free from political pressure, is definitively false. There was no rhetorical flourish in that devastating sentence. There was no unnecessary excess. It was just a bright, direct line drawn permanently between a concrete piece of evidence and the massive legal meaning it carried. And then he asked the only question that truly mattered that day. On January 31st, 2025, did someone from the Trump administration directly tell you to bury the Epstein investigation? That is not a complicated question to process. It is not legally ambiguous. It does not require a deep philosophical interpretation, and it absolutely does not allow for an escape through clever, twisting language. It is either yes, or it is no, or it is something else entirely terrifying. The massive chamber went dead silent once again, but this time, the silence was not born of anticipation. It was the horrifying recognition of what was about to happen next, because there is indeed a fourth option in devastating moments like this one, and it carries far more weight than either a yes or a no answer. Patel's attorney shot to his feet before his client even moved. And this time, the lawyer's language was entirely different. There was no more polite talk of needed context, there was no more reference to reviewing the tape, and there was absolutely no more attempt to gracefully slow the procedure down. Congressman, at this time, my client officially invokes his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. And just like that, the entire hearing crossed an invisible line that it could never uncross. Because invoking the Fifth Amendment is not a simple procedural delay. It is not a neutral, harmless act. It is a glaring legal declaration that answering the proposed question truthfully may expose the witness to massive criminal liability. It is the absolute legal equivalent of admitting that the risk is no longer just reputational, it is intensely personal and dangerous. Lieu did not react the way a typical grandstanding politician reacts. He did not smile, he did not celebrate his victory, he did not aggressively press the witness further, and he did not arrogantly try to extract more blood in a moment that had already handed him absolutely everything he came there for. He simply nodded once, very slowly, in the exact way a satisfied prosecutor acknowledges that the legal record has just flawlessly completed itself. The FBI director just invoked the Fifth Amendment, Lieu stated, turning his body slightly toward the bank of microphones, toward the flashing network cameras, and toward the massive global audience that was no longer confined to just that room. In response to a direct question about whether he was told to intentionally bury the Epstein investigation. And then, Lieu delivered the final crushing line that completely reframed the entire last 15 months in a single, devastating contrast. He could have just said no. That is the exact part that lands the hardest. Not the volume of the room, not the clever phrasing, but the sheer, undeniable simplicity of the logic. For 15 long months, Kash Patel had repeatedly said no in every single form available to him. He did it through endless deflection, through dense procedural language, and through carefully constructed, lawyer-approved answers that smartly avoided direct contradiction. But in the one critical moment where a single, simple word could have instantly restored his control, he chose not to say it. Lieu calmly closed his transcript folder. There were no cheap theatrics, and there was no extended, grandstanding commentary. The American people can absolutely draw their own conclusions, but those conclusions were already solidifying long before the chairman's gavel even came down. Because within a matter of mere minutes, those 7 devastating words were no longer contained to that hearing room. They were rapidly clipped, endlessly looped, subtitled, and pushed aggressively across every single digital platform where that agonizing silence could be replayed and studied frame by painful frame. 38 seconds of absolute, terrifying stillness analyzed not for what was actually said, but for what was noticeably absent. And here is the vital part that truly matters, looking far beyond the partisan politics, beyond the massive egos and personalities, and far beyond the immediate, visceral shock of the moment. If the actual director of the FBI can be cornered and confronted with his own undeniably recorded words inside a sworn congressional hearing and actively choose not to deny them, then the real question is no longer about just one buried investigation. It is about whether the entire justice system, which loudly claims total independence, can actually withstand the crushing pressure from the very executive power it is constitutionally supposed to keep in check. Because this specific crisis is not about a political party. This is entirely about whether the rule of law actually applies the exact same way when the stakes are at their absolute highest and the powerful people involved have the absolute most to lose. So ask yourself this critical question, not merely as a passive viewer of the news, but as an active citizen watching a historical record being built in real time. If those 7 words are indeed true, what does that horrifying reality say about every single case that mysteriously never reached the public eye? What does it say about every critical file that suddenly stopped moving forward and every single controversial decision that was conveniently explained away as standard procedure? And if they are somehow not true, why on earth was the absolute simplest word in the English language never spoken when it mattered most? If you made it this far through the breakdown, hit the like button, drop your own detailed analysis down in the comments, and share this video with someone who still naively thinks hearings exactly like this are just boring political theater. Because what you just witnessed was not theater. It was pure, undeniable evidence. And if you want more deep breakdowns like this one as the massive story develops over the next 48 hours, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on your notifications.